Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from A AP Ferg called Always Strive and Prosper. Okay, way back when I started starting the show in 2013, I took a crack at discussing A AP Ferg's debut album, Trap Lord. And you don't have to tell me that that review is pretty rough in retrospect. Putting aside that it was done before I actually had a proper camera, it was also a record that screamed style and flow over substance, which to me at that time didn't feel particularly cohesive against gothic-tinged trap production that initially felt too dark to fit in with the content. Sure, I can appreciate the tracks where A AP Ferg was indeed spitting his ass off, and his collaboration Lord with most of Bone Thugs-n-Harmony remains a highlight to this day, probably his best song, but for the most part, it was an album that was trying for a certain opulence and grandeur that I wasn't really convinced it could pull off, especially in the lyrics. The album's grown on me a bit in retrospect since then, but honestly not much. But granted, that was in 2013. Since then, we've seen so much hip-hop tilt towards material that's even more gothic and opulent, and at least A AP Ferg could maintain a consistent flow on his own and not slather his vocals in auto-tune to drive the melody. And given that I did quite like his lead-off single New Level with Future, I figured I would give him another chance with Always Strive and Prosper. The one significant reservation I had, though, was the larger-than-ever list of guest stars. A AP Ferg can have an odd tendency to mimic the flows of his guests for better or for worse, and given that I have pretty much zero expectations of finding much of a lyrical identity, that didn't really help him stand out. But then again, Future really was the worst part of New Level, and with a more impressive list of producers, I had some reason to believe that this album would come together with at least some flair and style. It would be interesting. Was I right? Oh boy! Let me start by saying that I have no idea how old fans of A AP Ferg are going to receive this album, because while the signs were out there that he might pivot in this direction, I don't think anyone could have predicted Always Strive and Prosper. Part of this is because it's a total mess of an album, I'm sorry, across the board too, but a larger part is that while I'm inclined to brand certain songs off this album as sellouts, this album has too many weird turns as a whole to completely fall into that category, and as such, it's an incredibly hit-and-miss album, with some great moments side by side with some of the most inexplicable rap songs that I've heard thus far this year. Okay, so let's start off with the only remotely consistent element, and that's A AP Ferg himself. I'm not going to deny he can flow with a lot of energy and passion with a very expressive tone. I might have issues with a lot of his content, but he's always been one for style over substance, and he does have style and flair, especially in terms of a lot of his descriptions and his bars. And I'll admit, I'm a little bit amazed by how earnest a lot of this album feels. You can tell that his affection for his family and his girl, they are legitimate, as is his desire to inspire people. However, this is also an album where he feels inclined to sing a lot of his own hooks or throw in more melodic elements, and it really is hit and miss how much of it actually lands. By far the worst moment coming on Uzi Gang, where he contorts his voice into this high-pitched squeal midway through his verse, not helping the lyrics where he describes giving the girl cunnilingus over the toilet. Gross. And it's not helping placed against his guest stars, most of which unfortunately show him up. Missy Elliott is the first and most obvious case on Strive. She's just a better fit for against that production than A AP Ferg is. We'll come back to that. But later, Schoolboy Q delivers a killer verse on Let It Bang. ASAP Mob brought some solid bars on Yammy Gang. Even if it is a bit of a weird choice for an ASAP Yams tribute, given some of the subject matter, it's not all that different from what they would normally rap about. And even though it's completely hollow, I thought Rick Ross sounded better than I would expect on Swipe. Granted, it probably wasn't the best idea for Rick Ross to talk about being a drug kingpin on the same song in the same verse where he brags about meeting the president, or for Future to go off on another flexing verse on New Level where he really can't match Ferg's energy and sound as good, or for Big Sean to go completely off topic on World Is Mine and rant about girls, and by placing certain rhyming syllables right next to each other like go-go or dodo, it just doesn't sound good, or for Chris Brown to rhyme ridiculous with particular, even though I will say Chris Brown's rapping is arguably better than it's ever been. And then there's Uzi Gang, featuring Lil Uzi Vert, and while his bars and flow are nothing to write home about, the larger issue is that right after that song, which I don't think is all that good, right after that very aggressive, violent trap banger, the tonal whiplash on the very next song, Beautiful People, which starts with Chuck D speaking on Black Lives Matter, it's jarring as hell. And that's where we have to get into the content and a lot of the contradictions that really frustrate me on this album. On the surface, A AP Ferg's story of his come up and and success isn't entirely unique, but he injects it with enough detail to make it interesting, make it his own, especially considering he doesn't shy away from the grime and some of the nightmarish pictures, particularly his uncle, who he describes as a psycho, even if he does kind of idolize him. And you know what, if he wants to make aggressively violent or empty trap bangers that don't really stay on topic or have any purpose outside the club, that's fine, I'll give him that. It's not for me, but I can appreciate that. But where I take issue is when A$AP Ferg tries to be deep and inspirational. Well, it's because he's really not that good at it. I don't get a sense of ideology or deeper thought or even spirituality or anything anchoring A$AP Ferg's words. And by accentuating so much of the detail of the negative stereotypes he embraces wholeheartedly, it comes across as dangerously misguided. Take for instance Let It Go, a song where after a skit when his girl finds a condom wrapper on the floor, she vents about how his rapping about screwing around is demeaning and embarrassing to her. So A$AP Ferg spends the song trying to reassert his commitment to her and explain that he's just talking about screwing around as inspiration for others, an excuse that he says that Jay-Z used. Okay, 2 points here. 1, that's not good inspiration for anyone, and 2, that wasn't an apology for being likely caught cheating, and it's not like this is gonna make his girl feel any better when he keeps on making these songs, even if they're not about her. And it gets worse on World Is Mine, because A$AP Ferg lays out his goal of being rich and successful and not being an underground spitter who might never make it big with content. In other words, he just wants to feed into a system that rewards empty greed over actual content, which really makes his big inspirational message feel incredibly hollow and token to me. I appreciate the honesty and his commitment to give back to his family and community, which that feels genuine, I'll give him that, but it really rubs me the wrong way how blatantly shallow it is, especially considering he's trying to pump it up with so much bombast. Of course, if A$AP Ferg wants to be a pop star, the production of this album does more to position him in that lane than ever before, because Gone is nearly all the atmosphere and mood that made Trap Lord feel at least cohesive sonically. Instead, we have an album that careens from style to style with jarring transitions and some god-awful sequencing. And this starts early too. The opening track Rebirth starts off with some elegance before bringing in an ugly, choppy synth line that feels clumsy as hell, which continues into Hungry Ham. And you know what, I go back and forth whether or not the sheer off-kilter nature of Skrillex's production actually fits that song, but no matter how good the drums might sound, that synth reminds me of a rubber ducky, and the vocal overlays are garish, borderline cartoonish even. And that's the frustrating thing. This album does have some great drum production and occasionally some real elegance to it that really sucked me in. I really like the sax that came into Psycho and Grandma. I thought the live drums on I Love You sounded great against the gentler backing synths, and Ty Dolla $ign's bridge worked there too. I like the backing groove on Yammy Gang with some of the strings and more minimalist beat, or the sheer eeriness of Let It Bang that really worked with the subject matter. Hell, I even stand by what I said about New Level on Billboard Breakdown, with the careening string section that hints of the horns. And one of the cases where A$AP Ferg's vocal production gimmick, he layers just enough reverb to make his voice sound a little bit more cavernous and impressive. It actually managed to work on that song. I like that song. But for every good instrumental choice, we get the incredibly shrill synth line on Swipe that feels lacking any sort of body in the mid-range, which you kind of need when you have Rick Ross on the song, or the oily clunkiness of Uzi Gang, or the incredibly chipper hip house beat on Stripe that sounds even too bright and poppy for Missy Elliott, let alone A$AP Ferg. It feels like something that Jess Glynn would sing over. But in the end, is this album any good? Well, after a number of listens, well, it's got some moments that work. I can appreciate the earnestness and the good flows and the interesting descriptions and some decent song ideas, but it doesn't assemble to any cohesion or deeper themes. And sure, you don't need that, but if you pitch away all the atmosphere that sucked in listeners on Trap Lord for production choices that don't seem to make a lot of sense, even if you are hunting for more radio play, I'm sorry, this album's a mess. It really is. And I legitimately have no idea if the fans are going to be on board for some of these choices. So while I'm giving it a strong 5 out of 10, I don't know if I can recommend this for anyone else outside of just the spectacle. Then again, given that seems to be exactly what A$AP Ferg wants with this album, well, mission accomplished, I guess. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this is going to be something of a contentious opinion. Just try to keep it civil in the comments. But I've got the poll up there, so what did you guys think of this album? Did it manage to come together for you? Because I really wanted to, and it just kind of fell all over the place. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. And yes, next up is Beyonce. I'm going to be covering it. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.